Hi everyone, you're very welcome to our August version of History Club. My name's Joe Walsh and we have very excited to introduce Murray Query as our guest this month. Murray is a psychotherapist. She has a strong community background, including youth work, which I know from personal experience is not an easy trade to be in. Murray is also an active trade unionist with Unison. She's a long-time campaigner and advisor and advocate for the LGBTQIA plus community, and has worked on the Love Equality campaign, which led to equal marriage for us in this wee part of the world. Murray is here tonight at the request of our History Club members and volunteers who have requested Murray as one of the people that they would like to hear from. So tonight we're going to ask Murray to have a wee talk about an event that took place in the year 2000. It was called Irish, Queer and Equal, and it was a panel and audience discussion on identity, politics and community. So Murray, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us tonight. We're really looking forward to this. So the spotlight is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe. I'm very flattered to have been asked, even though the History Club, it implies that I'm old, which I am now, but with some reluctance. So the event is called Irish, Queer and Equal, and there's a question mark attached to it. So I'd ask you just to reflect on each of those terms. Irish, queer and equal, because 23 years ago, people had a very strong reaction to each of those. I don't know if any of you, was there anybody here who was at the event? No, it was part of, I'll explain a wee bit about the context of it first. And as I say, Joe said that you can interrupt me at any point. I'm going to explain the context, and then
was the event during Pride that year?
Sorry?
Was the event during Pride that year?
No, it was part of Féile and Phobal. And
was it on the Falls in
yes,
the old Presbyterian church?
It was in Culturland.
Yes, Culturland, yes.
Yes.
I was there.
So I think you were there, yeah. I mean, it was packed. There was about 200 people at it. And, and I'll explain, Claire, why it was part of Féile. I was a member of a group called Clarnaman, which means Women's Agenda. And it was around, around the time of the peace process. And those of you who remember, suddenly all the women disappeared off the screens and off the radio, and it was largely straight men who were talking about the future of this part of the world. So Clarnaman was set up as a women's organisation, and there was a fair smattering of lesbians, of dykes within that, to look at the future of Ireland in an all-Ireland context. We had a conference, but as they say in Irish, sin scéal eile, that's another story. But part of this, we had conversations with Peace Watch Ireland. And really at the time, the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement was only 2 years old. There was no legislation around protecting our rights as LGB and RT in terms of employment, in terms of goods and services. You could still be thrown out of a cafe or a restaurant for holding hands or kissing your partner, and there was no marriage equality. So we had concerns that that there was a small burgeoning group of, the Rainbow Project was going, Carafriend, Queer Space, those organisations. But we really felt that Féile was part of, it's the biggest community festival in Ireland, it still is. And we felt that it shouldn't just be us as queers, who were initiating discussions, and we felt very strongly that Féile should be doing something, and had spoken to people in Féile over a period of years. At one point, somebody suggested running a disco in the Felons, and I was saying, no, well, that's not really the the best foot forward in terms of reassuring people that it's okay to be out in your own community. So Peace Watch Ireland agreed to support Clarnamana, and we had discussions with them about raising the whole issue around what we're always being regarded as othered, and that actually we are, and I can see people who are present here who are very active members of their community, their trade union, in a whole variety of capacities. Now, that was largely invisible. They talked about queers or lesbian and gays as though we'd come from another planet. And I remember a woman in the Shankill Women's Centre saying to me, oh, that, we only existed downtown. And I knew that the Shankill dykes were were very present, could I say. And so it was about, using the structures that existed to try and get the issue raised a bit more. So, so we were encouraging Féile to be a bit more inclusive. The other thing that it came from was that there was a movement at the time that LGBT people were excluded from the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York, and Peace Watch Ireland had about 50% of their membership in the States would regard themselves as queer, and they were quite concerned about that. And people were quite angry that Gerry Adams had headed up the St. Patrick's Day parade when when they were banned from from participating. Now, there's a whole story, and you can ask me about the St. Patrick's Day parade if you want, but I'll try and cover a wee bit more first. Then the other piece was, as Joe said, I started out as a youth worker, then trained as a teacher, worked in adult education, and then largely because of the distress that I saw quite often my drinking partners, but lesbian women in particular, and gay men that I knew whose mental health was shredded, including my own, could I say, at the time. And I trained as a psychotherapist. So I became very aware of, for about the last 18 years, I've supervised counsellors who work in the post-primary schools. So I was really aware of how, even though things have improved, that the stress that young people were being put under in terms of self-harm, in terms of suicide ideation, and the bullying they got at schools. So we're concerned about that as well. So Peace Watch Ireland were very useful, and they helped fund a number of activists from New York, because the reason that we phrased it, Irish queer and equal, well, could you, it's now called intersectionality, but that term wasn't widely used. In fact, the term queer wasn't very widely used at that time, which, Gareth will be able to tell you about the response that you got, because it had been used largely as a term of abuse down the generations. And it's like Dyke were trying to reclaim it. And I suppose I was reclaiming it for myself. And because it was Féile, the director of Féile, who was Katrina Ruan, she felt that it was really important that Gerry Adams was there to give it, proper kudos, to say this is as important as West Belfast Talks Back or whatever. So he came down to introduce it, and I was asked to speak to him before he came, and I used the term queer, which, to be honest, I was still, because my name's Query, do you know what I mean? Queer by name, queer by nature. I used to get at school. And I always remember Queerspace producing the headlines, queers queried by query. You know, it was so it didn't roll off my tongue particularly. So I said to Jerry, you know, that queer was the term to be used. And he said, look, he explained to me as though I was from Mars, that queer generally meant, you know, like a queer fella, you know, that it was something that was odd or different. And so we talked about it, and I said, well, look, Jerry, you know, it's the young ones who are using it. I said, but LGBT is okay. So anyway, he ended up using the term queer. There's a copy of the report that was produced afterwards, if you can see it, Irish Queer and Equal, and Joel will send out.
Sorry, Mary, I was at that too, because I remember that report.
Yes, were you, Claire? Yeah. So it's I mean, it's a good while ago now. I'd say quite a few of you were. So anyway, the people who were invited, then there was two speakers from Peace Watch Ireland, both Black, one a Black lesbian, the other Black who described himself as queer, and they felt it was very important. They had been involved in the civil rights movement in the United States, and they were also active in New York, and I think Joan was from further south, from South Carolina, I think, and Clarence Patton, who's from New York, was involved in it. I mean, it rang very true with us here, that he was saying as legislation became more liberal, that, you know, LGBT people became more visible. And in fact, there was a lot of violent attacks, and they couldn't rely on the police to protect them. So he was involved in an anti-violence project. There was also a speaker from Glen, Gay and Lesbians in Equality Network in Dublin. There was another white Irish American called Sean Cahill, who was from South Boston, and he was also talking about how he was involved in supporting Irish American rights, and that, you know, when he came out, he was rejected by his family, that it was very difficult to come out as queer and to be regarded as Irish. So the main I mean, I must say I was very moved both by the speakers and also by the discussion afterwards. I must say that Jerry got a very hard time from certain people in the audience about Jerry Adams. This is about not, you know, about agreeing to head off the march in New York City. I mean, and in fact, we all had thought he was just going to come and introduce the evening, and he stayed for the full evening. And there was quite a mixture of people there from all backgrounds, as Claire and Gareth will say, will testify, because one of the things that occurs to me looking back on it, we don't often have very public debates in our community, and it felt it was very healthy to do so. I remember that that particularly the two Black people, were saying how difficult it was for them to be involved in the civil rights movement and then to be called into question because they were queer, and that they weren't being supported. And equally, when they were involved in LGBT groups and campaigns, the fact racism within the queer community and organizations was not being dealt with. So they found that they didn't really have a home, and it was quite difficult for them, and that wherever they were, they had to fight to have those debates. Now, I would be interested in what yourselves think about that. Is that, do we carry some of that ourselves? Do we carry some of, and we will do, because we're all reared in a society that is homophobic, that is racist, that is misogynist, so it's not surprising that, I'll put my hand up in terms of, racism, disableism, that so rather than condemning ourselves, what we need to do is address it. And I suppose that I felt that the Irish Queer and Equal was posing the question, can you call yourself Irish and be queer? Do you, for example, have to describe yourself as, a gay Irish person, a gay British person, or is the assumption made that you're white and heterosexual when you say I am Irish, or I am British, or I am Northern Irish?
Yes,
and that is still...
Mary, that it seems to be from before the time where intersectionality was recognised, and you only seem to get one label. The introduction of the document says that they wanted to challenge the notion that being queer was something that was outside of West Belfast community and outside of being a nationalist or Republican part of that tradition. I think it is an indication that you probably only were allowed one label at a time.
Yes, and quite often, and I say that the women's movement, because I was the first worker part-time, could I say, on a pittance, the first worker in the first women's centre in the north of Ireland, and it was considered, oh God, not only is she a feminist, but she's also a lesbian. It wasn't considered putting your best foot forward. And it was considered a smear to say, oh, does that mean that, feminists are all lesbian? That was regarded as an insult. So firstly, I can come on to sort of what some of the issues were that were raised, but I'm kind of curious as to what drew people here, and if you don't want to speak yourself, maybe you could put it up on the chat. What was it that interested you in the topic? Gareth, why?
Sorry, can I give you just a little bit of information about one of your speakers? Because I made a connection with one of your speakers, the George Walker, and I don't know, and he went on to be quite successful. Obviously he was a politics person, and he actually ended up working with the Obama administration. We're still connected on Facebook, and when we left, I became friends. That was my first time into West Belfast, and it was a completely wonderful experience for me as well, because I met people from America, and all sorts of people that I didn't know. So it was really kind of eye-opening for me, and when George left or whatever, he gave me a little book. So he did. It was the Tale or Sanctuary, Paul Monet, but he inscribed it, and he actually said, "Enjoy reading this, and may peace and love are just around the corner." So it was talking about the peace process as well. So it was very quite nice or whatever to have that connection. So, and it's good to see that the people young people at that stage went on to progress in their careers and their political careers and their and whatever. So I think it was, as a queer person, that must have been very good for him as well. So
yeah,
it was a fantastic event. I still remember it well.
And what was fantastic for you about it, Gareth, aside from meeting influential people?
Yeah, well, it was just like, it was like, that was my first time really socializing in West Belfast. That was the first time I was, up in Cultureland, so the whole thing was new for me, but also the very fact that it was a big event, and it wasn't like it was a queer event, and it was proudly queer, but it was much bigger than our normal like pride events that you knew everybody in and everything, had a different feel about it. So I thought I was quite impressed with with that it was like we reaching out into the community as such. And it was great crack because we went up with a big bunch of people and we hung out and we went drinking and it was great.
We go as a group, a queer space group that night.
Yeah. There's a whole whack of people went up.
To be honest with you, I don't remember much about that night because I think I get really drunk later on. Like
you probably did, yeah.
Can I say I did as well? And I was in crutches and ended up in the Kremlin in crutches. So, I must say, I decided that was really everybody should have a pair of crutches in the house, because you can score really easy. You get a sympathy vote.
Mary, can I ask a question? Do you remember the queer ceilidh that we had?
Oh, yes.
So was that pre-2000 then? I can't mind. Just can't be mine. I just can't remember.
Yeah, I think the queer ceilidh might have been the year before because, as I say, we made a couple of goes at trying to get Féile to take on, rather than us always having to do it, that Féile would see that they needed to have a queer event as part of Féile. I mean, it was very, so the queer ceilidh was really a small but select group of people, wasn't it?
Yeah, we were all great dancers. Well, we thought we were anyway.
We were, I think we were. But we got better the more alcohol we had, as I recollect, or we thought we got better. But it was really heartening this year is that that Féile did put on. There was a discussion on sort of trans. Well, there was 2 trans women who spoke, and also there was a really impressive Afghanistan lesbian woman who talked, and in fact she raised the same issues. That she said that she was an activist. She felt very welcomed in Ireland and in the Afghan refugee and asylum seekers community in Ireland. Once she came out, she was rejected, and she said how painful that is. And I remember how painful it was to be rejected by your own, because I was out in the trade union movement as well, and it was much more painful than taking abuse from some randomer in the street, to take homophobia from people I regarded as my allies, even if it was out of ignorance, even if they weren't aware of how painful it was. But I was very pleased that that Féile had, I think they might have even had a disco in the Felons, but that they had 2 events that would be regarded as queer in Féile this year.
There's a message in the chat. Murray, someone said that the title of the event is what attracted them this evening.
All right, okay. And I wonder, yes, I can't see the chat now, but yes, and I wonder what it was. Was it about the title that attracted them? Is it still an issue, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's amazing to see that the event took place in the first place, because it's such a big arena and it's not normally the topic for discussion for that arena, West Belfast Féile. And I think people are interested to know that we were represented there one time.
But sorry, I would say that we were represented there a lot of times, because on the Féile walk, the Féile march, there's always had, there's definitely been not a gay theme at all, but there's definitely been gay people being very quite get. I mean, you know, I live in West Belfast, and I would have used. I haven't been to one of the marches in ages, but you know, you could have known, like, the people who had maybe transferred their exact same truck or lorry or whatever it was they'd used in the Gay Pride March, you know, maybe only a week or 2 weeks before, because they're actually quite close together at the timeline. You know, and I would have said you quite easily would have recognized, and there would have been lots of flags, you know, pride flags and rainbow flags and stuff. So I'm not sure it's the only time, Joe. You know, I think it would have been for years, really, and very well, you know, very welcome. But I remember as well that you know, sometimes it was a bit as the marches used to be back in the day, a little bit sexualized, and I think that I can remember, that's probably why I can remember it. But I remember being young lesbian and out, probably, you know, out enough, but still being quite embarrassed by what was then my, no, supposed to be my community, really, because it was just quite sexualized, and it was quite family. And I know that I probably shouldn't have been, but maybe I had a little bit of internal homophobia myself, you know, internal, you know, who knows. But anyway, I just thought that I would say, well, I don't think it was just a one-off. I do think that you know, it was probably pretty represented for years, you know.
Yeah, probably the first, or one of the first.
It was the first, because I was the first. There was 4 of us who marched up the Falls Road for the first time ever with a banner that said, "Gay brothers and sisters, come out." And I walked up the road, and various people came up to say hello, but they didn't join in behind us in case anybody would think they were gay. And I remember seeing people that I knew I would have seen at Pride, maybe not marching in Pride, but along the streets. And it was a case I understood why people weren't marching and didn't join us. But in fact, there was a group of young people who were, you know, who were from a group that represented disabled young people, and they had a band and everything, and you know, they weren't ashamed to be seen with us. You know, that was it. Everybody else was. So people thought the band was with us, you know. So, you know, it took the bad look of us. But there was just 4 of us that year. And there weren't flags. I mean, it has changed. That was about, I think that was about 2004, 2005. So it was after this. So I suppose it shows, you know, that really it takes, it is really important. It was one of the messages that came through very strongly for me at the Irish Queer and Equal event about how important it is to build coalitions. You know, you can't berate politicians for not having the right message if we don't tell them, you know, what the right message is. And as everybody here knows, you know, we grow and develop and evolve, and what was acceptable in the year 2000 is no longer, you know, and that we need to build more coalitions. I think that was one of the things that that I learned, and also to encourage community festivals themselves, because our argument was, this is not, you know, even though it was great, you know, Gareth, that that was your first time, you know, at Féile and in West Belfast, we were emphasising this is for your own queer community, that the queer community in West Belfast is largely invisible, and that, you know, you have a responsibility, you know, to look after and to show that you recognise that there is a queer community within the West Belfast community. And to be honest, they accepted that, but didn't know how. As I say, the suggestion of a disco in the Felons, I didn't think really quite made it. But as you say, Gareth, it was a big event, so it got a lot of publicity. And it was, you know, regarded as, you know, serious. Whereas, unfortunately, the trans event that was held this year, I think there was probably maybe about 15 people at it. You know, it's held during the day. But, you know, it's still going.
A comment in the chat, Mary, a person has said, can we be Irish, queer and equal? And they've emphasized the word equal. And they've said, we can be Irish and queer, but they don't feel that we have equality, especially within the Republican community. Does anyone else get a sense of that? And did you feel anything like that, Murray?
Well, no, there was a comment there. You were going to say something. Is it Nigel?
Yes, that's right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I can reflect on that and say that there is definitely a disparity for equal treatment whenever we go across the border or if we stay where we are in our little state of Ulster. And I can only really echo an awful lot of what you had to say already, Mary, whenever it came to the old-fashioned hangovers that we've been left with. What I mean by that is a lot of the male dronings have continued onwards, even though they have been identified as the wrong thing to do. The male things being misogyny and to treat women like as if they were second-class citizens or not even human at all. So whenever it came to people who were ever identified or had the finger pointed at them as being a dyke, a lesbian, or a bisexual person, and that of course meant that they got treated especially a lot less equally. It's ongoing, it's reducing, but it's still ongoing.
Yeah, I agree, Nigel. And one of the things that that I argued with Republicans was that when they held the referendum in the South around marriage equality, now and I think it was sort of, they were quite concerned, you know, about would they win it or would they not? But they galvanized loads of young people, allies, who went around door to door. And I remember Brian Sheehan, who was, I think, one of the co-directors, he told me that he went to the door and, you know, and he was kind of fairly well dressed because there was that thing, he was representing the queer community. And the guy who answered the door said, "No, son, you know, there's nobody here in this house." And behind him, his daughter came up and said, she came out to the father on the doorstep and said, "Actually, you're wrong, Daddy, because I'm gay." And Brian said he nearly died, you know, like that wasn't what he had bargained for, was have to support this young woman. But, and, you know, and sometimes people got terrible homophobia delivered to them, but you knew that after that there was a shift in society, whereas for us up here it was just, you know, it was kind of granted. And I'm not sure if there was that opportunity for people to discuss it. Now, the Minister for Finance commissioned myself and Paula Keenan to try and have a similar kind of process. We met with over, I think it was about 300 people in different groups, everything from, you know, from the GAA to, you know, the British Legion to, you know, disability groups, women's groups, and we said, look, you know, this is coming, marriage equality is coming. You know, we're in favor of it, but this is not about converting you. We just want to have a conversation with how you feel about it. And it was interesting because it wasn't anything to do with us. In at least 3 of those meetings, I remember, you know, one person who launched into how, you know, how desperate it was and that this, you know, the whole queer thing was being forced on them. And the Church of Ireland minister beside him said, "Actually, I'm gay." You know, he came out to him, and that happened in the Shankill. There was one, we met with an older women's group, and there was one woman who was in her 80s. And for the first time, she told the group that her son was gay and he was in his 50s. And she started to cry because She had been in that women's group for 30 odd years and felt she couldn't say, you know. So there's been a little bit of a shift, but I agree, Nigel, that it's not very public, it's not very visible. And while, you know, queer organizations are better funded, you know, I think that piece of encouraging community groups, you know, it's not just about leave it to themselves, you know, that they need to be supporting, you know, their own queer communities.
Yeah, I've especially learned that the hard way whenever it came to the topic of isolation and being queer, because I live out here in Fermanagh, Mary, and that means that although it's very familiar territory for me because I grew up from a farming background, but dealing with that very prospect of how do you deal with yourself whenever you know that you are queer or LGBT in any way, and you don't know what to do because the further away from Belfast you are, the more isolated you are from information. And before you know it, you get left behind, and then you come to the conclusion in your own time that you don't have any help no matter how hard you try. And it's a repeat of the words of Jeffrey Dudgeon. You know, is there a queer community out there? Who do you ask? Dare you ask for anyone at all? And and then you do get left behind. It's been a long, hard road, and I say that like as if I've been part of it. I haven't, because you know, how many years have we went forward, Mary, and you're still having to solve people's problems for them.
Nigel, I would say you are part of it. You're organising for Man of Pride.
Yeah.
Oh yes,
part of that team.
We'll mention that I'm the secretary for Man of Pride later.
No, that's very definitely part of it. You know, and I suppose, and the one thing I'd say, Nigel, that even though, you know, it's a relatively small bunch of people here, is that it amazes me how people will say, you know, 20 years later, is I remember when you said that, you know, is that I think it is very hard in rural areas. Still, it's very hard. Now, and sometimes, you know, while social media can relieve some of that isolation, social media can be as dangerous as it is. It can be as negative as it is positive.
Yeah. And I can recall growing up, I grew up in the Short Strand, which would be considered a nationalist stroke Republican area. And for me, growing up, it always felt like Catholicism was tied in with Irishness and nationalism, and you were never going to be equal in terms of being a Catholic because you couldn't really be part of it and be gay. So for me, that kind of excluded me from Irishness, if you like.
Yes.
Can I ask, Mari, is there any photographs of that event or any footage or anything available? Because it was quite a remarkable event in terms of getting out there into the community space, and it was. Is there anything there, or even that banner? Do you know the banner? Is there any photographs around? I'm thinking about the History Project as well, because I think that's definitely the sort of
I've got a photograph of the. You mean the banner that said "Gay Brothers and Sisters Come Out"? That one.
Yes.
I do have a photograph of that, and in fact, I think Danny Morrison did a history of Féile for, was it? It might have been a couple of years ago, and there is a picture of it, but it's really weird because one of the people carrying the banner, I have no idea who she is. I don't recollect her ever carrying the banner. Sort of feels like, I don't know, was it doctored or something? But so I've got a very nice colour photograph actually of it. If you wanted, I could.
Yeah, please do send it into the project via Joe. That'd be amazing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I will do. Yeah.
And is there anything off the actual, you know, in the event itself? Was there anything? Because people didn't have mobile phones in those days, so you didn't have a camera on you, you know. And then often, I know it wasn't a club, and it was maybe a more better opportunity to get a photograph. But see, if you'd been out in a pub or club or something and take a camera out, everybody would have just ran because they didn't want to be out.
Yes, and you would have to negotiate it. And I suppose, you know, well, I mean, we didn't know how many people would turn up. I mean, we were quite astounded that over 200 people turned up. I mean, it was standing room only at the back. And I suppose that's one thing. I mean, it's great that Mary Ellen and Joe are involved in a history project, because we weren't aware that we were making history, and that we should record everything. And so it wasn't recorded. I mean, it would have been possible to record. Nobody took a photograph, as far as I'm aware. So no, which is a real pity. But there is no photographic evidence. Whereas even that 3 years difference of going up the Falls Road and I had asked, I had said to Pride, would people not join in? But there was that sense of people felt, well, there was and still is a feeling that, if you marched in the Féile parade, even though it was not political, people felt that they were associating themselves somehow with the Republican movement, even though it was all community groups. But it was regarded as, I suppose, a nationalist event. So
I was
yes,
going to say the socialist movement. Yeah, the socialist movement was another one of them that you were associated with. You were a commie.
Yeah.
That was a funny one.
So,
yeah, well, yeah. So the intersectionality. So that's another story about the being queer in the trade union movement. But Gareth could probably tell us many stories about that. Is how it's funny, people forget somehow that I was, you know, a strong feminist, but they always remember that I was, you know, lesbian and stroppy in the trade union movement. You know, less so now, I must say. Unison, my union has a very active LGBT section.
I remember being in a union meeting, and it was just after GFS came in, or was it Section 75? It was one of the early pieces of legislation, and we were putting forward a motion. I can't even remember what the motion was, but somebody in the row behind me, to kind of old union reps, were going, "Isn't it wonderful how legislation and laws empower people?" Because they were observing people putting forward motions for the first time, because there was a sort of a safer space in terms of legal protections and stuff. So it always stuck in my mind. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So.
Yeah.
Excellent. Has anyone got any more questions before we stop the recording?
I only have one, but if anyone else has any others, I'll let them go first.
Okay, nothing in the chat.
Nobody? Joe, Sarah, Alex, Adele?
Go ahead, Nigel.
Okay. Mary, you had to train as a psychologist to get a better grasp of how to deal with these very misunderstood issues of mental health. So how long was your training, and did you even have any help whenever you finished your training to deal with the whole community?
No, and you know, I didn't train as a psychologist. I always said I was part of the Hedge School of Gestalt, that we relied on, and to be honest, when I started the training, I didn't aspire to be a therapist as such. There was 2 women who came over from Scotland, and they started a training group, which would now be called Diploma. This was in the, this was about 1992. So it was even, you know, before the Irish Queer and Equal. And, you know, and I was always out. So they started up a group And we fundraised for that so that people who were unemployed could do it. And that was 4 years. We did 4 years. But now the Gestalt Centre in Belfast runs training. So I didn't train as a psychologist as such. But, you know, once you've done a diploma, there are now other avenues. At the time, there was no counselling organisations of any shape or form. So, and at that stage, Rainbow weren't, I think Rainbow had started off largely, they got funding to do, I mean, there's people here who know better than me, to do HIV testing. And then they gradually expanded, and now they have a counselling service. But I suppose one of the things, Nigel, that and that's why I'm an activist still, is I don't think you can be a therapist without being an activist, that to actually prevent what is, you know, driving all of us, you know, that is making our mental health so much worse than the majority of the community. And that one of those is, I mean, you've said it yourself, Nigel, is that it's sort of isolation. And if we are part of a group, instantly your mental health improves. So even just all of us being here tonight, even though it's on Zoom, you know, and we're not actually breathing in each other's, you know, bodily odors, as it were, is that it is good for our mental health, you know, that so while and I don't feel, I mean, individual counselling or therapy has its uses, but I mean, that's why I feel that, for example, that our schools are not, you know, are not providing decent support for any child around their emotional health, but particularly for young queers.
Yes.
But if you're interested, there's just there's a diploma, but it's a postgraduate diploma that has, you know, started now. It's into its, I think, third weekend. So I went through an alternative route. You know, I didn't go to university and do psychology or anything. And there are alternative routes now that are available.
Great. I've got two more questions from the chat for you, Murray. First one is, what were the biggest wishes for the Irish Queer and Equal Talk back in 2000? And what more can we do for equality in the nationalist community?
Yeah, well, I suppose it was interesting. I remember in particular one young lad who was at the Man's School, and he felt very, very strongly that he didn't want to have to go downtown to be himself. And he made a very strong plea for recognition of his existence in his own community. And I think that struck home, because there was a lot of people there who, you know, quite a few straight people, including Gerry Adams, who actually took that away with them. And that was the biggest recommendation. And I suppose it was the secondary piece that came certainly from, I've actually got a little quote here that from, yeah, I'll just read this out, because I think this creates it. And this was said by Joan Garner, who's a Black lesbian woman from the States. So to create a more unified social justice movement and a more humane society, it is important to integrate the struggles for liberation by integrating work against racism, sexism, and economic injustice into the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender organizations and anti-homophobic work. You know, so that, you know, and we haven't talked about class as being the big invisible one that really, I don't think our queer movements, we have addressed the issue of class and how that impacts on us, on our struggles. So so that's the piece, I suppose, and I think that still, you know, in answer to the second question, that still stands. And I've always said to people that I suppose what moved things forward was we became more visible. And I think, you know, we are now more visible, but what we need to do is we need to ask the trade union movement, community organisations. I know that Ciara and I are in discussion with the Commissioner for the Elderly, is that, you know, they need to be doing this work now, because there's enough information, there's enough research has been done about numbers and the rest of it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Maybe to follow up with that is a little quote that we got from the rally against Posey Parker that we had this year, and that was from one of our performers, Dick Van Dyke. There is no excuse anymore. Old age, young age, ignorance or anything. The information is out there. So if you don't have the information, it just means that you're not making an effort.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, and just a final comment is someone has said that they would love a talk based on class in the queer community. They think that that would be interesting. So maybe that is something that we can arrange for a future event. Okay.
Yep.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to stop the recording and continue